Hallo Freunde, es ist 10 Uhr am Dienstag in Redmond, mehr oder weniger, und es ist Zeit für .NET API Review. On the one hand, I feel like my German is both getting better and worse. Confidence is tricky. All right, we have a whole lot of issues for .NET 8. People have, I guess, realized we've started a new version, and we have a set agenda today, so we're going to ignore the order that it says here, and you'll ignore the people moving behind me. And yeah. So first up, we have ref safety rules attribute number 76032. Chuck and Fred? No,
Yeah,
you're not allowed to walk on the keyboard today.
this is Chuck. I can talk to this one. So ref safety rules attribute is an attribute that's emitted by the C# compiler when compiling with either Lang version 11 or .NET 7. The attribute indicates the version of the ref safety rules that were used to compile the assembly. The attribute is not used in source, and the C# 11 compiler emits an error, reports an error if it does appear in source. It's a module level attribute that the compiler emits to the compiled module. And the key thing is that the compiler currently emits the attribute type declaration to the compiled module if the type declaration is missing from the compilation. So the proposal here is to add the attribute type to the BCL so that the compiler wouldn't emit the attribute type declaration in all cases. So a few points I'll make here. This is the C# 11 compiler has already shipped, and the C# 11 compiler already emits this attribute. So clearly we're able to behave correctly in the absence of this attribute type declaration appearing in the BCL. This is really about reducing the instances where the compiler needs to omit the type declaration. And we've also raised a number of similar proposals in the past for adding attributes that are only used by only emitted by the compiler, for adding those types to the BCL. Some have been included in the BCL and some have not. So a couple of recent examples: native integer attribute, which is not part of the BCL, and required member attribute, which is. One last thing, I'd say there are a couple of additional considerations with this particular attribute that may be important to know. One is, unlike some other attributes, such as nullable attributes, the ref safety rules attribute is not directly tied to a feature that the user opts into. The feature is really just compiling with Lang version 11 or .NET 7. If you have such a compilation, the attribute module level attribute gets emitted. And then the other thing is that we emit to all modules that contain any type declarations. And so that second fact, that it's emitted to basically to most modules, has some impact. I mean, for instance, it broke a number of tests in Roslyn and a number of tests in the runtime that assumed that no additional types were being emitted. So it's not a showstopper. It's just a statement that there is some impact to emitting this attribute all the time. Okay, I think that's all I had to say about to present some context.
I have a couple clarifying questions, Chuck. So my assumption is, if we're at it, we're going to add it with this name because the compiler cares about this name already. We wouldn't want to have the compiler start looking for two different names or two different shapes. And potentially the only thing we could do here would be to make int version into a getter, because I'm assuming the compiler doesn't actually care about that field. Is that a
Yeah, so to the second point, I don't believe we use the field. So I think that could be a property with a getter.
But everything else is basically a done deal if we're going to add it.
Certainly, it would be easier if we just stuck with this API shape. If we add a second attribute, as you say, we would have to look for both attributes.
Okay. And my second question is a more general one. I personally have no problem with us adding this, especially I'm assuming all 200 or whatever of our assemblies actually now have this baked into it, and we would consolidate all those down to one if we made it public in Corelib. My second question is, why don't we just do this in general? Like, what made us want to make this one shared in Corelib, but we have others that we don't do that for?
So previously we've said we've basically had the viewpoint that if it's needed publicly or everywhere, then we should have it in Corelib. But if it's more an implementation detail of the compiler, and it's not actually something that users need to or should be inspecting, then we haven't exposed public information about it.
So
Looks like Fred's hand is up too.
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to say is that my only concern with making it a property is just make sure that it's not an init only property. It should only be settable via the constructor. But yeah, that's it.
As a meta question, when attributes like this are being just made up and emitted by the compiler, that affects the language. Do we now just assume that Roslyn is the only C# compiler and will be the only C# compiler forever? And that that's also true for all the other .NET languages?
No.
Because presumably this impacts something, or you wouldn't write it down. So what does a COBOL.NET compiler do when it sees a ref safety rules attribute in a module?
So the language, what this is defined or will be defined in the C# specification, right? It's not about what does this, right? It's not about, okay, this is how Roslyn emits things. It's, okay, this is what the C# specification says.
Okay.
And Roslyn is an implementation of the C# specification.
So the language is specifying it, and the language spec in whatever form it exists in says what this means, which is different than the ECMA runtime specs.
Right.
And language is doing interop. Basically, at this point, if you're doing a .NET interop language, you need to assume that all the C# rules apply to you, even if you think you only need to read the runtime rules.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Just, there is the distinction between .NET and C#, and C# is a choice versus .NET is, or of all the things that can interoperate with .NET. So it's, as we talk about these things, it's just one of those like, oh, the compiler makes this up and writes it down. It's like, okay, great. Who says that that's what .NET means now?
I mean, you don't have to support ref safety rules at all, right? Like you can ignore them at your pleasure. You will cause bad behavior in other things, but
Fair enough. But again, like the comment, it's not permitted in source. That's really only true for Roslyn.
Oh yes,
it may be stated for C#, but if you're
F# will totally let you. F# lets you put a lot of things in source that
right.
that C# does not.
In particular, if you wanted to write something that the F# compiler is not going to write down for you, then you would need to specify it in source. So, if you wanted to look like Roslyn built it with the C# language.
Yep.
So. Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I feel like ref safety rules really should have been like ref safety rule version, but it, to Steve's point, we're either saying okay or we're saying no, and it seems fine. Does anyone want to say no?
Well, that actually leads into a question that I had, which is an int version field by itself enough? Do we also need some type of like freeform string field, just in case you have different switches that might be introduced in the future?
Chuck?
Yeah, I don't have a strong feeling there. We felt that when currently this version number, to be honest with you, this version number is the version number of the compiler where the ref safety rules were introduced, where the version change for the ref safety rules was introduced. So the only expected value at this point is 11 for that version. We didn't expect to change the ref safety rules on minor version updates, for instance. We thought it would be a rare occurrence, and so that's why we thought int seemed sufficient.
Yeah. And I guess there's nothing stopping us from adding such a field in the future if merited, right?
Yeah,
True,
we could always
although
come up
maybe
with an encoding scheme of, put int.max value in the version, and then in order to know what that means, you need to go look at this other thing, right?
Okay. I'm just asking about future proofness. That's it. Sounds like
it's always tricky when we change the version that we're emitting, because then we need to figure out how that interacts with existing compilers, like the C#11 compiler, for instance.
I mean, yeah, I guess I'm curious what happens if the C#11 compiler sees ref safety rules 17. Does it say, I'm sorry, I can't talk about this guy because I don't know what the rules mean anymore?
Yeah, I think the current plan is currently it ignores that and will assume that it can use C#11 rules, but I think we have a bug open to error in that case.
Fair enough. Anybody have anything else on it?
I guess sorry, before you quick comment, the one question that I have is, are we going to make someone's life difficult by changing the version getter to, it's like someone doing reflection or something like that? Are we going to make their life difficult by changing the version from a field to a property?
Yeah, don't most of our attributes use read-only fields?
No, the only thing that uses fields publicly is value tuple, and it shouldn't have. We have a rule of no public fields.
Value tuple is special though, and it really needs the public field so that it can be used in all the scenarios the compiler wants to use it, including addressing and other modes, passing the field by ref, decomposition, etc. It's special. It needs to break the rule.
But
now, vector 2, 3, and 4, those ones should never have been public fields, and they are.
fair enough. But yeah, the attributes are, if you take something in the constructor, you are a get-only property. And if you don't take it in the constructor, you're a get-set property, and attributes don't have fields in the ref.
I mean, if we say that we're fine with, making someone's life a little difficult in reflection scenarios, and who is even reflecting over this anyway,
Yeah.
I'm okay with that answer. I'm just asking it before we say yes.
Yeah.
It's
I wonder
probably...
if
Sorry, go ahead, Chuck.
I was just wondering if how much of a compatibility issue this will be to change version from a field to a property at this point. I don't know.
I think from Rosalind's perspective, we're fine. It's just a question of...
Yeah.
Consumer perspective.
It's like, I assume Rosalind is only reading the...
We're reading the constructor.
Yeah, Rosalind's going to read the constructor call. And not actually look at what happens in the attribute usage. And nobody could really be reading... I mean, they could read the version field via reflection, but isn't it just easier and more consistent for them to also read the constructor argument?
I would assume
Yeah, because that's how attributes are declared, yeah.
Because, nothing says that this constructor assigned that same value. It could be complicated.
Okay.
Boom.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. All right. Quick error address not available. 76435.
Braddock, I think you're up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to get my camera working, but it probably doesn't. So never mind. So yeah, we have found an error case which we haven't covered before when we designed a quick error enum, and that error in question is that the address family which you are trying to use for connecting is not supported by the operating system. Either it's disabled or for whatever reason is not available. And in order to communicate that to the user, we need another enum member in the quick error.
So I can say address not available. I would assume that means, you asked for a privileged TCP port without being privileged, or it's in use, or something like that. If it's I don't support this address family, then I think we should put family in there somewhere.
Well, what we are doing is we basically plumb the error number from underlying OS, and we try to stay consistent and not assume it's something very specific. So this, for example, on Linux is EAF no support. I assume that if you try to open a privilege port, you will get something like something about permission, a different error number.
Right. I'm just like looking at the error. If I was reading just the title of the enum and then even the summary that's written here, the requested address is not available on this machine. So I used that like the specific address versus like you asked for a what's a thing nobody uses an legacy ARPANET address, and like no, we don't have a driver for that anymore. Like, so if its address family is not available, then I think the enum member should be address family not available, which is what the Unix error says. Address family not supported. You guys are being noisy today.
Okay, in that case, it's probably fine. Yeah, we could change it.
Does anyone want to dissent?
So, yeah, I mean, last time we had a quick error come up. It was ALPN in use, which I felt strongly should be address in use because that's what people will actually check for. And you'll miss the ALPN use, which is like the same thing, but it just happens to be in the same process. But we decided that we were matching the MS Quick API. So I don't know why we're doing anything different here. Like, I think we matched it 1-to-1 to this point, So
the LPN case, what that was the error code in case of LPN was chosen by Quake, like the library itself, and in this case they are just passing the thing that comes from the operating system, so it's platform dependent and anything. So there's a slight difference here.
So this isn't like a quick status defined?
No,
this is,
no.
Okay, I see. That does make it a little different.
Yeah, I posted in chat also. On Windows, the unreachable error code on Windows can also be induced by a misconfigured firewall or something like that. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the address family is unavailable. It basically means like something's going wrong, and I simply can't, for various reasons, I just can't reach out.
I remember we had some problems finding out what is the equivalent error status or error code on Windows, because whenever we tried it, like disabling IPv6, for example, we got something like this. And there is also something like WSA AF no support on something like that, but that did not turn up. But
Yeah, and it's okay if, you know, the error is induced by different conditions on different operating systems. Like that's just, you know, the way of the world. We should try to unify them when possible, but sometimes we simply can't.
Yeah, I mean, like, it really, it's, you know, what's the error that is being represented, and what's the way that we should explain it to people, and what are the things that we're going to try and map across various operating systems. And if what we're saying is when you have no IPv6 addresses bound on your local thing, that we don't get, that one of them complains about the address family and the other one complains about the address, then we have to, I guess, decide what that is. But, you know, even in the proposal here, your name is address, the comment says address, and the text says family, and they're different. And so I think we need to know what we think the error is before we name it.
Yeah, you could also just have two different errors. Like if you actually know that there is an error condition that is caused by the address family not being available, then have an address family not available enum value. And if there's another enum value that you need due to, you know, air quotes, some arbitrary error that we don't know about, then have a different enum value for that. There's no need to force them both into a single value, right?
Yes, that's completely right.
And maybe it just so happens that on Windows we will never display the address family not available error if we can't know for sure that that was the underlying cause.
Yeah, because there is a net reach. Like, POSIX defines net unreach, which looks more like the WSA net unreach, which maybe they kind of both sort of mean the same thing, but presumably the system has decided that in this case there's a difference between I don't like the address family at all versus the specific network I couldn't reach out to. So, and besides, address in use feels like it's a, or address not available feels like it's a server thing, not a client thing. And this says it's when creating a connection, which sounds like a client thing. So address family not available makes sense as a client. Address family not available also makes sense as a server, but address not available to me sounds like a server problem. Like you wanted to open a port and it can't. I was like,
Okay.
I mean, I could be wrong, but that's what it means. That's what the words, the impression it's putting in my head.
No. I think you are right. We should make it a little bit more clear.
Yeah. So it's really, what are we trying to represent? Is it network unreachable? Is it address family not available? Is it both? At which point the error is called MISC.
Well, based on this discussion, I think we should probably add two members because, like Levi said, net unreachable on Windows can be caused by different set of errors, which is not necessarily that address family is not available, but some other misconfiguration. So we should probably not force those two types of errors into the same enum, because it possibly could get confusing.
I should also ask, like the API usage here, the example that's given says if the error code is address not available, then it prints out a very specific message to the console saying doesn't support the address family. Why wouldn't we just put that message straight into the exception itself? Like, what's the scenario that we're actually trying to support by having a new enum value here?
So the point of the enums was that we didn't want to have different derived exceptions unless we really need it for some reason, and instead let user distinguish between different kinds of failure based on the enum, so they don't have to, so they can programmatically react to the type of failure that happened. Of course, the text of the exception would contain something like something relevant based on the quick error enum value.
What's an example of a programmatic reaction to this specific error code?
So for this specific, probably is just to log the exception and not try again, but for others it could be something else. I'm sorry, I can't figure example on a spot. We are just following a pattern on which we have decided earlier in the design.
Okay, because it seems like we've started going down a path where we're basically trying to mimic a networking stack, even though we don't necessarily know why we're doing it. If the entire point is to make logging better, more detailed, like exception is already rich enough by itself to do that. So I'm kind of at a loss as to why in code I would ever put any of these enum values into a switch statement.
Yeah, I mean, really the question is, when is this going to influence the continuation of this program in a way that internal error would not? Like, I can understand looking at the list, connection timeout. That may be, okay, great, we'll try again. But, you know, address not available, address family not available, etc. What are you going to do differently? If it's address family not available, and this is, instead of doing DNS quad A, you want to do DNS A, then that's a reason. But is that actually a legitimate case?
Yes, it's a very good question for which I don't have an answer at the moment.
Because I think really, to expand on Levi's point, we should only add things to the enum if somebody has a legitimate case for handling it.
I will only add here that we have been getting progressively more feedback requesting programmatic, granular data from exceptions like this, if not necessarily the specific case.
So that in that case, that really means that the error code that you produce actually has to be like, honest to God, we mean this when we return this error code, if we're expecting you to make a programmatic decision on it. So that said, like if we introduce an address family not available error code, for example, like then as long as we know that the only case in which that error code actually will be returned is if the address family is not available, and other errors go to either an existing generic error code or we introduce a second one. But like I still am very suspicious of the scenario where people want granular information here aside from just this is transient and I should try again, versus this is something that requires human interaction.
Yeah, I agree. I'd like to see a use case.
The other thing too is let's say that these error codes are in the buckets of transient versus human interaction required, right? That means, in theory, adding any enum value whatsoever here is a breaking change, because we're now not going to be able to express to callers, here's a new value that hopefully it falls into one of these two buckets that you already have coded up, and unless we have like an is transient property that you can query, like you're going to have known ahead of time what this value meant. A good example of this is like when we added the the string split options enum value a few years ago, like we had a debate as to whether adding that enum value was a break and change or not. We decided ultimately it was not, because we're the only consumers of that value, so we can always change our own implementations. When you have arbitrary user code consuming a value, like adding values that you expect them to switch off of is legitimately potentially a break and change. Just keep that in mind if you expect people to use this programmatically.
Yeah, I mean, I believe our answer is we will add members to enums, and every caller should account for that. I think that is our ground position.
So if a caller cares if a value is, or if an error code is transient versus not, anything that they don't understand is automatically not transient.
Or transient, whatever they feel a good default is.
So if the address family doesn't work, they just keep trying until the app eventually ooms.
Yeah, I mean, like they're probably, even for a retryable thing, only going to say like whatever, try 3 times, and if it fails, sorry, we're moving on. If it's you don't have an IPv6 address at all, I can't route this, then after 3 times it's still consistent. Or maybe in the meantime you brought up a network adapter and now it'll connect. Because you actually, like, there's no such thing as an error that is permanently non-transient or is always transient. Like, it's, things can change, especially with networking and connections and whether or not a cat decides to yank a wire out of your router. Not that that happened to me yesterday. So,
I mean, are we also maybe being a little bit too strict on this? Like, given that it is an existing pattern?
yeah, so my real thing is, 2 different errors are here. We see that there's an error that looks like this one that's part of POSIX, which means this is doing very fuzzy mapping. We're doing very fuzzy mapping. Address not available, looking at the list, sounds really like address in use. So now you need to be a PhD in networking to understand what the difference between the two is. So this name is just bad. And so it's what name or names do you want? And then the meta question of why does anyone care? Because once we're not mapping, like if we had a very easy, you said you were mapping in this one scenario, E net unreach to WSA E net unreach, then okay, that's network unreachable, and that's the name of the thing, and it's a consistent networking error code across platforms, or at least POSIX says it's supposed to be, and ta-da. But once it's fuzzy mapping, it seems that we're better off just saying something didn't go right, here's the error from the underlying network stack. Deal with it. If you care, understand what platform you're on and what the error codes mean. And if you don't care, it failed. Try again or not. But, like, trying to be helpful is bad when we're being fuzzy.
Makes sense.
Meanwhile, if you do have a use case for address family not available, I'm not opposed to that being added. I just want to make sure that if you return that, that actually is the honest to God reason that the connection.
Sorry, can you repeat that? There was some break in the connection.
If we do have if we do add this thing that you're proposing, and let's say that it gets renamed to address family not available because that better describes the scenario, I would be okay with that if we make sure that that error code is only returned when the address family is not available. So maybe that means that the Windows error code can't map to it unless you have other reasons to believe that this is the situation.
Yes, that I understood from what you said earlier, and I agree that would be a good idea since not to cause confusion by mapping this enet unreachable to the same as AF no support. So I actually liked your idea of adding distinct ENA members for those two, but we will have to work more on the proposal and maybe come back with better proposal.
then would we tentatively approve address family not available then, since it sounds like you do have a mapping for that somehow?
I mean, in my opinion, this is just sending it back with notes. Needs work, and that there's nothing to be approved today. Somebody can argue differently, but that's the feeling I have.
I mean, I think we can do an address family not available, but I think the team's probably going to want to come back and add another thing like next week or the week after.
But that comes back to the point of why are we adding it? Of why is this actually different in a programmatic sense from internal error? Who is ever going to add something in the catch that cared about this value? And if the answer
Because
is we have one and we have a scenario and we want to do it and we want to make sure that we're mapping it on Unix and Windows, and when we get quick working on Android, that it works on Android, and that we're going to always consistently try mapping this one error, great. And if it's a fuzzy match and we have no use cases, then don't add it.
I mean, the way that I interpreted this is because we're basically standing up a networking stack, and networking stacks have error codes, hence we should too.
To me, it's add another int property or that the quick exception should be wrapping some existing network connection exception, which is here's the underlying OS code. If you care at that level, switch on it.
Yeah, that sounds like that should be exposed regardless somehow for people who really want the details. I mean, so the networking team's on the line, right? Like, do you think it would be worthwhile to somehow extend quick exception to expose the raw OS error?
We have considered it, but there's a problem that it doesn't have to be the OS level error which is causing the exception to be thrown. There's cases like the other side has closed the connection or has closed the stream or something happened. So the error doesn't necessarily have to come from the OS. It can come from the transport layer, from the quick layer itself.
Okay, so it sounds like what the difficulty you're experiencing is that you're trying to wrap an error that could come from the transport layer or from the socket, correct?
Right. I mean, one answer is it shouldn't be a quick exception at all. That it's just, a socket exception.
Yeah.
The other is that quick exception should gain the constructor that says it's allowed to wrap some other exception, and it wraps the socket exception.
That's honestly not a bad idea if this is at its core a socket exception, right?
Well, like I said, we throw quick exception on one of the derived types, one of the very few, when the application layer closes the connection, because that's considered application level error in the protocol. And there you have also some error code provided by the application layer. So now we have it's kind of tricky to get this right. So we somehow ended up with this kind of design.
Sure, yeah, and that's fine. But say that Jeremy's earlier scenario, the cat yanks the network cable out of the wall, and you just get knocked offline completely. Like that would manifest as a socket exception primarily, correct? And then maybe you have some transform where you build a quick exception on top of that.
Well,
but sorry, go ahead.
It would manifest as in current implementation as a quick exception with quick error timeout, and the timeout will be will originate from the transport layer because quick is on UDP, so plugging out the cable doesn't necessarily immediately cause the connection to fail. It will just time out after a bit. But
I see. Okay.
But
yes.
Yeah.
For some reason, I always thought that losing the physical layer caused every protocol, including UDP, to fail immediately.
Well, there is also a thing that Quick will, after some time, will allow having connection over multiple network interfaces at the same time, the multipath extension. But that I think is going off topic. So.
Okay.
I mean, doesn't it depend on whether the OS recognizes that the NIC's actually disconnected versus like not responsive?
You can tell when the physical layer gets disconnected.
Yeah, that's
like
what I
there
mean.
there actually is a physical voltage change that can be detected by the card.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think it can tell which end of the cable is disconnected because the cable doesn't loop back, but it knows I'm no longer plugged into the other side.
Yeah.
Right. It can be annoying sometimes when you're trying to test various timeouts and the OS is too smart.
Yeah. So it sounds like Jeremy's typing up then, come up with a potentially more comprehensive list if needed to get back to this.
Well, because the real problem fundamentally that I'm having with this, I think, in addition to the fuzzy mapping, is at the end of the day, you're going to recreate socket error. You're going to say address family is not supported, address is already in use, apparently address is not available, which is different than these other two things. Like, you're going to build up to wanting to represent all of these errors because these are the networking errors, and that means you just want to say something went wrong in networking that was at a lower level than quick, and so that's called socket exception, and it's called socket error, and like we should not copy and paste all of these enum members into quick error. Quick error should be about errors in quick, not errors in UDP.
Yeah, but I can kind of see an argument though. If quick is supposed to be an abstraction that isn't, doesn't necessarily follow the standard OSI model, then things get very weird very quickly.
And I can be convinced that my feeling is wrong there, but once we're adding socket errors to quick error, my question is, why is it different than socket error?
Oh, well, one of the reasons why it's different is because there are two cases like that application on the other side closed the connection and closed the stream.
That's two different types of exception that can come out of the same call. The two enums don't need to be merged. Like, quick exception's an IO exception, depending on what claims you're making. Like, a socket exception's also an IO exception. It still conforms to some aspect of the contract. We don't have Java's checked exceptions, so we get to decide how loose our API definition was. But I mean, heck, things like file.open don't only throw IO exception, because access denied exception isn't a IO exception. But
I think socket exception also isn't IO exception, it's system32 exception.
Really?
But
lame.
I think so. I thought it was IO exception as well, but then I looked it up.
Yeah, socket exceptions and Win32 exception.
We're good at API.
We are. I mean, .NET 1.0 days, right? .NET Framework 1.0 days. But as part of the notes that you're typing up, Jeremy, I think investigating having quick exception take a proper inner exception as its constructor argument might be worth investigating too. That way, if there is an error through something, right, like the operating system simply told you something went horribly wrong, you could at least wrap that so that you can give the caller the full fidelity while you make a best effort to map it back to whatever your error code is. Because as a caller, I would always go to the innermost thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, going to the innermost thing is hard because inner exception will be exception. So now you're being fuzzy off of it again. But
yeah.
So yeah, I think based on the existing address in use name that's there, address not available is not good unless POSIX says there's a difference between E in use and E not available, in which case, great, we're carrying on networking's tradition of you know what it is or you don't. But that I don't think these two things are the same code. And so we need to be clear on what we want, and I, as a meta point, don't think we should add anything that looks like a socket error to the enum.
But what if you're inventing sockets? Anyway.
Then I would try to come up with better names.
Okay. Cool. Is there anything else then, or should we move on?
Yep. So what he said.
Oh, just out of curiosity, the existing enum values are just monotonically increasing numbers. You're not trying to map. You're not trying to do like a direct mapping of these values to like existing protocol values, correct? You're okay with just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
They are monotonically increasing. We have not fiddling with the values.
Okay, great.
All right. So I bounced that one back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Add support for missing member handling to system text JSON 37483. Is that Eric T? Or Eirik?
See, Eric is unmuted, but we can't hear him. We could potentially come back to this in a sec if he's having microphone issues. Oh, no, he's okay. He's restarting.
Yeah, we'll see if he joins quickly, and if not, then we'll skip.
Let's see here.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay then. So the reason why I'm bringing this in is that it's one of the most highly requested features for system text JSON. It's basically just replicating a piece of functionality that already exists in use of JSON. Essentially, it's kind of the opposite of what was shipped with required properties in .NET 7. So in use of JSON, missing member handling is effectively a flag that controls whether deserialization should fail if there exist there exist properties in JSON that fail to bind to any properties in the deserialized object. So the API proposal more or less follows the API shape used in use of JSON, as in there's an enum called JSON missing member handling, following the naming convention for system text JSON types in general, and that can be set on the options class to affect a global setting, or it could be set as an attribute on the type level to affect the setting for the specific type, or via the JSON type info, so that can be configured via the contract customization APIs. And I've included a sample at the bottom that shows what is expected to happen if JSON missing member handling.error is specified.
And this is achievable today by, you could add the property of here's the dictionary where stuff that you couldn't figure out where it would go, and then you just throw if the dictionary is not empty after deserialization.
Correct. There is a workaround, but it needs a bit of boilerplate. And with .NET 7, you can actually use a bit of magic in contract customization to affect this globally, but it involves using conditional weak tables. So I think it might make sense to, offer this the proper way.
Fair enough. So if you had a Boolean, we'd ask if you wanted an enum, but you have an enum with two things. So do you think there's ever a chance that there's a value other than 0 or 1?
I thought about it, but I couldn't really come up with anything. Maybe there is.
And I could. So you have. How do you mark the field right now, the property that gets all the extra members? Is it has to have a special name or a special attribute?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
So whenever you have, say, overflow members on a type, right? Like I'm sending you a JSON object that has a member foo as part of the dictionary, but there's no foo on the type I'm trying to bind to. So that gets added to a special collection somewhere. How do we mark that collection?
You can specify that via the JSON extension data attribute that can be applied to properties that contain a dictionary type, keyed on string and containing object values. So if you actually include a property like that in your model, any extra properties would be stored there. But obviously, if you wanted deserialization to fail, you'd need to add both the property and then implement a deserialization callback that checks whether the dictionary is empty and throw an exception if it isn't.
Right, okay. And if you don't have that extra extension data property, then everything just gets ignored by default, correct?
Yes, but you could introduce one artificially via the contract customization, but this is where the conditional weak table is necessary.
And this only affects the scenario where I'm asking you to bind a property foo, but such a property does not exist on the target object. Like if I neglect to provide in my payload a property foo, and that property foo does indeed happen to exist, that's not an error, correct?
That's the purview of a different annotation. It's essentially either via required properties in the C# language level or an equivalent flag that you can enable either on attributes or in the contract model.
Okay.
I don't think I'd mind if this was turned into a Boolean. I don't necessarily foresee a third option coming up. There isn't one in Newtonsoft, so I would assume that if a common enough scenario existed, it would have already been implemented there.
Right. Well, because on JSON type info, you definitely need it to be settable. We could rename it to be a Boolean, obviously Boolean property. But what's weird is it feels like on the attribute, like the mere fact that you've specified it means you know what someone's going to be passing.
Correct.
It's the at a type level of JSON disallow unmapped properties or whatever.
Yeah.
I could imagine that if you had a base class where everything was, if you had a base class and a derived class where you'd want to change behavior based on where in the hierarchy you are. Maybe that's a weird scenario, though.
What is your intended handling of this across derived types?
I mean, I wouldn't be able to think of a customizable scenario that doesn't involve using some form of callback in the first place. So, I'm guessing if users want more advanced scenario, they should just use the extension data attribute with a deserialization callback like in the workaround, and for everyone else who just need their deserializer to validate that no properties have been dropped, this should be good enough.
Right, so since the attribute says it's not inherited, and assuming that today I'm remembering what that means correctly, a derived type would reset back to its allowed.
Yeah.
Or sorry, that it's back to ignore. So it's whatever the target T is gets to decide what the policy is.
Yeah.
And not its base classes or derived classes.
Mhm.
Then at that point, you could potentially make the argument as to why an enum would actually be useful. Because if you're using introspection to try to ask, what would this type have done had I tried to deserialize a payload into it, there actually is a tri-state. The tri-state being everything that I don't understand I ignore, everything I don't understand I fail on, or everything I don't understand I throw into this other dictionary.
Well, like Jason required, we didn't accept a Boolean of like, I've changed my mind. It's
right.
The attribute is present, and that changes the behavior. And in this case, this one attribute wouldn't even describe all three because this is at the type level. In order to find out if there's a drain bucket, you would need to go read the properties.
Well, yeah, that's what I was saying. If you're talking about this enum only from the point of view of declaration, then from a declaration perspective, there's ignore and error. That's it. If you're looking at the enum from the point of view of, I want the enum to tell me about the runtime behavior of this type, then there are definitely more than two options. If the enum is telling you about, if the enum is used for introspection in addition to behavior or in addition to declaration.
Yeah, but I assume that the notion of there being a drain property is already encapsulated in JSON type info. The whatever you call the unmapped thingies.
I don't see such a thing in there.
Because theoretically the JSON type info says, or maybe you're supposed to loop over the properties and ask the property, are you the special drain bucket?
Yes, JSON property info has an is extension data property that you can query.
Okay.
So you're right, you would loop over it. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, like if we expanded it to ignore error and map as extension data, then great. Now you just have if you set this to map as extension data and you didn't have an extension data property, now you're just invalidly configured. So the fact that this needs to work with an existing suite of stuff means I think it's back to just being a Boolean.
And we would just call it row on something. Row on unmapped members.
Disallow unmapped members. Or disallow unknown properties.
I would probably think missing member has a connotation from Newtonsoft API, so would it make sense to keep that terminology?
Okay. I mean, can you come up with a Boolean expression that involves missing member?
Throw in missing members.
I mean, throw on is probably the prefix we want because we're going to throw if that's true.
I mean, on the one hand, I agree if you're coming from Newtonsoft JSON and you understand this feature, you're looking for a thing with a similar name. The trouble is if you're deserializing, which is when this applies, it depends on if you're looking from the perspective of the payload or the type. Because it's the payload specified a property that the type doesn't have. So it's missing a member in the sense that if you call it via reflection, you'll get a missing member exception. But it's not missing in the sense that it's actually specified, and that's the problem.
So unrecognized maybe instead of missing?
Yeah.
because I see this thing in the payload. I didn't recognize it, so I'm about to fail. The name is different than JSON, than Newtonsoft.json, but
Do we have Boolean properties that say, you know, throw on? I feel like we generally go with something more like disallow.
We don't have properties, I think, but I'm pretty sure we have various parameters that does that.
right. Well, that's normally considered an anti-pattern if you put it on parameters, but whatever.
It's true, but I remember recently having a conversation where we concluded that in that case it was the right thing of doing it. So
yeah, because
think
I
it
know
kind
in
of
reflection
depends.
we do it all the time, and I love it.
Yeah, I know that an existing thing from previous versions of FDG says don't do that.
Yeah.
Maybe you want two different public methods instead of a Boolean, but
Yeah, so allow or disallow would also work. Generally, I would probably lean toward allow rather than disallow, because now you have like a double negative that you have to think about.
I mean, the question is somebody going to be confused by this new property shows up, it says allow and the default is true? I mean, we can say the default is true. We can totally write that down in documents or in documentation. And it's different than overloading where generally the expectation is zero values or what are passed along. Which is,
I wonder, could we somehow phrase this in terms of require? So require, I don't know, binding to member or something like that. Obviously, that's not an actual proposal, but I'm wondering if we could phrase it in these terms.
Well, the thing is, you already have a concept of members that are required to be bound, where them not being present would be treated as an error. And I wonder if it would get too ambiguous with that.
well, but that's saying that on a property that this property is required. And you could, on the type, if you said like, you know,
Yeah,
JSON require property
required
match.
is scope to the property, whereas this is scope to the type. But I do get that it might introduce ambiguity in a sense. I wonder if there's a terse way in which we could distinguish between the one type of required and the inverse type of required, which we're proposing here.
I think you would probably just use a different adjective at that point.
So I'm catching up on the notes I haven't been writing down so far. Carry on.
Well, so you call this extension data, right? Normally, these extra parameters.
Say again?
So you normally call these extra values extension data, correct?
Yes.
So I wonder if maybe we could reuse that terminology, like disallow extension data or something like that. That might be a little confusing because normally I would think of extensions as, you know, values that begin with $.
I tend to think of extension data as the bag that accumulates any extra properties, but I wouldn't think of properties not binding to members as extension data per se.
Fair.
Another thing that I'm noticing, so I'm going through some of the APIs we've shipped already, and there's a property in JSON polymorphic attribute called ignore unrecognized type discriminators, which is essentially an inversion of this flag. So I'm wondering if we could phrase it in that way as well, saying kind of ignore extra properties or ignore extra JSON properties and default that to true, which is the current behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I would still lean toward using the word unrecognized as opposed to extra, but sure.
Yeah.
So ignore default is true, and if you set it to false, it will throw.
Yeah.
What happens if you put this on a type that has an extra property or extra data info property?
I'm not sure I get the question.
So if you have a type that has an overflow bag, and then you go and slap this attribute on it, on the type itself, that says disallow everything that's overflow, what happens?
I would expect that the two would be incompatible and it would throw at configuration time. So if you have both a bag and you say, please throw an exception, then these two it would be impossible to enable both at the same time.
Okay.
All right. Do we land on a name?
I was leaning toward ignore unrecognized members or something like that.
In this case, it would be ignore unrecognized JSON properties, maybe.
Yeah.
To emphasize, yeah.
I mean, that might make sense here, but at the attribute, I don't think we would call it JSON ignore unrecognized JSON property.
Yeah.
It seems weird to have JSON in the title twice.
Another problem with that name is that the default would be true, and that would be the case whenever we specify extension data. So adding stuff to the property bag while ignore equals true, that seems kind of strange.
I guess, yeah.
So then
the
call
problem
forbid.
is we need to name the we need to name the attribute whose presence is now forbidden or disallowed or prohibited.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think if we can't find a compelling name, I would probably suggest playing it safe and, just emulating the Newtonsoft naming scheme, because this is precisely meant to cater to people looking to migrate in the first place.
I don't necessarily buy that argument fully. It would also, be useful to people who are standing their own stuff up for the very first time, right? It's a useful feature in both stacks. But if you want to, kind of tweak the name in order to make it more familiar to people coming from an existing thing, then that seems reasonable, as long as it's still within our guidelines. By the way, I do like the enum that you had the first time, even though it only has 2 values.
Hey, it's future-proofing.
Yes. Well, also, it honestly, one of the benefits of having an enum like that is, yeah, we have to have a little bit more, argument checking, but the names are self-described. It's great.
I mean, I don't know. Disallow unmapped properties looks reasonable to me.
It's a bit of a mouthful.
People might disagree. I was just doodling some names while you were throwing out words. Because really the problem is that you couldn't map it, right? So it's not that the property name doesn't exist, because the property name could have been aliased with a JSON property name. So it's that something came in that you couldn't figure out where to write it down into.
Is mapping a word that is commonly associated with serializers? I guess the question is, would somebody understand what this property is meant to do just by looking at its name?
I want to say data contract serializer actually uses map in a few places, but I don't know that.
Binding is the usual term.
I could say unbound properties.
Well, binding normally refers to the act of putting data in or getting data out, whereas mapping refers to the correlation of where data exists in A versus where it exists in B. I'm actually leaning toward, after all of this discussion, I'm leaning more toward the original API, honestly, that was proposed.
I mean, again, my point on the name that James picked is basically he was describing his behavior of if he uses reflection and gets a missing member exception, what's he supposed to do? And that's a very specific perspective of what's going on in deserialization that I don't know is a natural one.
Well, that's why I was pushing for using the word unrecognized instead of missing member, but otherwise keeping the fact that it's embracing the fact that it's an enum.
Okay, unrecognized.
So could we just have an enum called JSON unrecognized member handling?
I mean, we can, which is just go back to the original thing and rename missing member to unrecognized member or unrecognized property, because from JSON's perspective, they're all properties. Like in the JSON space, whether you chose to do it as a field or a property in your .NET type, yeah. You are in JSON land, you are a property.
Yeah. I mean, this is an issue with Newtonsoft's API as well, but the name itself doesn't necessarily convey whether we're talking about JSON properties or whether we're talking about .NET properties. I think member kind of suggests that we're talking about .NET members rather than JSON properties. There's no such thing as a member in JSON.
Yeah, I was thinking while we were talking just now, like you could, if you stretch, maybe think that disallow unrecognized properties means like, oh, this property on your object returned type bar that I didn't know how to serialize, so I'm just going to pretend that property didn't exist for the purposes of serialization. Like that's stretching, but I could see how people would mistake that wording.
Fair enough.
But at that point, like documentation.
Okay, so which way do we want to go?
I think we should keep member. Missing is debatable.
So are we going the Boolean route or are we going the enum route? And then, yeah, what do we want to call things?
I think Boolean should be fine.
Do we ever think we will have something else?
No.
We could always add another property in the future if needed. We've done this before.
Yes, I mean, like that's kind of like, if it's very unlikely, I think that's fine. If we reasonably can come up with something, then it might be easier to have it as an enum. But yeah.
Right, well, because the only thing I could think of that's different than ignore an error is callback, and I assume that's basically at that point you're just writing a JSON converter and you're not using any of these attributes anyway. But that's as far as my imagination went. I assume that especially if this was an early on feature in Newtonsoft JSON, if he hasn't added a third thing yet, then that means there's probably not a third thing to add. I mean, granted, we do have a third thing, which is put things in this other bucket, but that's not expressible by this property because it's existing behavior.
I mean, I kind of agree with what you said earlier about that. The problem is the direction, right? Like, if you don't know which direction this thing describes, it's always going to be somewhat confusing, no matter whether we name it members or properties, right? Because it kind of depends on what your mental model is, right? And I just looked at serializer options in general, and I think they all have their problem, unfortunately. There's a few things where it's kind of clear what direction it is based on naming, but we don't really have a general convention that answers that, which I think if we could go back and change the API, that's probably something we should consider in naming those things. But it might be worthwhile to, at least for the things that are super confusing, to like come up with a convention and then stick to it in the future. So one thing that we have here is read comment handling, I think that kind of makes it clear which direction it's coming from. Because you're reading JSON, so you wonder what you should do. So I guess, read, or I don't know, throw on unrecognized property in JSON, I think makes it pretty clear, but it's also very verbose, right?
Right. I mean, even I think disallow unrecognized whatever. There's only one direction that things can be unrecognized.
Well, except for what Levi just said, right? It depends on what you mean by unrecognized. Like you could imagine that, it's a property that has a type that I can't serialize, right?
But the JSON serializer serializes every type. It sometimes does it just as open curly, close curly, but it will serialize every type.
Yeah, you know that, but if you just read the property, what's your mental model, right?
Fair enough.
I think that's kind of the problem with all the naming conventions that we had so far is you have to know the direction that you're looking at, right, in order to make sense of it. It almost seems like we should have had serializer options and deserializer options. So it's pretty clear what thing this affects. I don't know.
So you're saying that Java's input stream and output stream did it right? I see.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I mean, maybe another option is to just pick a name and then just say / comments for the win, and we just, in the summary, we say when reading JSON from the wire, if we don't know what this thing is mapping to, this is what this behavior controls.
That's fair. All right, so we're still at this shape, but we want to know but we need to name it. And we do.
So what I don't understand what disallow means. It's okay, what do you do when you found something, right? If you say throw on unrecognized properties, then I think I know what the behavior is, but disallow is a bit ambiguous.
Throw on.
My only question is, have we ever done that as a configuration thing before? I feel like disallow is common.
In XML, we use forbid sometimes.
Yeah.
It also has prohibit, at least for the enum value of DTD parsing.
Yeah, I think it just maps to what the XML calls it, though.
That's fair.
In interop, we use throw on unmappable char. The configuration system uses throw on duplicate entry. So it looks like we do use it in a few places, very limited places. ASP.NET route handler options throw on bad request.
Do we have anything else that in JSON right now where we would have a throw behavior or a rejection behavior? I think they're all. We have disallow on the comment handling, right? Say JSON comment handling disallow, which I think translates to throw.
Yeah.
Yep.
So then maybe we should stick to disallow then, so that we're at least self-consistent on the same type of how we refer to these behaviors. Yeah, we also have allow trading commas. I guess that's the inverse of that is disallow. Yeah.
Well, the reason for comment handling in some enum is because there actually are 3 different behaviors you might want. For trailing commas, it's either ignore it or reject it.
I mean, one hypothetical third state for this thing is that you leave the configuration on a type ambiguous and you let global configuration apply its policy, but I don't see where that would be useful. I think it would just make things more complicated.
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
So you would have ignore, you would have error, and then you would have unspecified. So unspecified would be the default, and ignore would be the default on the options level, on the global level. But
Well,
again,
I thought I thought like the JSON serializer options are the options. Like, I mean, to me, they're kind of. I mean, there's of course some sort of hierarchy involved depending on what you use, like JSON. That's sorry, if you use ASP.NET, for example. But I think there is a.
Well, because
Like, I think unspecified seems odd.
at the big level, you wouldn't have a floating option. I don't think.
No.
It would be. So it could make sense at the type that the type level says defer to the global defaults, or the type could say on my type I don't care that the global default says throw. On my type, just discard the data, which would be the same as saying make extension data bucket, but I'm not going to read it. But don't waste the memory of creating the dictionary.
You say basically like the hierarchy as in like because you have type level and member level overrides, and then there's the environment one basically, which is the global situation. Yeah. I mean, I think the Boolean is probably the easiest thing. I think my last question is like, is there a reason why we go with disallow versus allow?
So on the right now, if we go with just the Boolean, there's what's the attribute called that you put on a type that says you want the new throwing behavior. That has to be named negative because the default is to ignore things.
I see.
I think that's ultimately that's kind of the con of using a Boolean. Like you need to you need to you need to specify what false means and what true means, and that by definition always makes naming uglier. Whereas you just call it missing member handling, with handling being the keyword, and it becomes neutral immediately.
Yeah, enums.
I mean, I kind of buy that. I mean, I was just wondering because you already have allowed trailing commas, right? It seems a bit weird to say this one is at the very top of the list and then the unallowed one is at the very bottom of the list because we just went with a different case. That was kind of why I was curious.
I mean, there is a trend in JSON serializer options. Like we've obsoleted booleans before in favor of enums. So ignore null values has been obsoleted in favor of don't remember.
I mean, every serializer eventually trends toward having enums in their options.
Yeah.
Like you see this on binary format or data contract serializer, XML serializer. Like it is a
right. Like if it was a Boolean, I would have asked should it be an enum, but it was a 2 enum, so I asked should it be a Boolean. Like it's
so it's your fault, Jeremy.
It's the make conscious choices, and as I put in the notes, the conclusion was yes, a Boolean was better, and then it was no, a Boolean is not better. So that means we have talked it out. Now,
what is defer in your model? That's basically it only makes sense for the type level.
Right. So there's a question of if we think these are the only 3 things, should at this level it be a Boolean so it's clear you can't pick defer, or should it just great, you gave me a JSON serializer options with defer, which we totally should talk about later.
There is precedent for that. So for certain enums in JSON serializer options where the setting doesn't make sense on the global level, we throw.
Okay.
I think that's a model I prefer because if you use the type system to model every single combination of things, you tend to corner yourselves in the long run as you change your opinion on what's allowed where.
That's fair. So this one throws on you aren't one of these 3 things, or you're the special I'm sorry I have no one to defer to value.
Yeah. Right.
That's fine.
And then the only suggestion is I would maybe not use ignore or error. I would stick to the other ones we have, which is kind of what was this on the read comment handling? We have allow, disallow, skip. For example,
is valid in this case.
Yeah.
Although technically, if you specify an extension data bag, then it's not actually skipped. But I'm not sure if we should change the name based on that permutation of configuration.
Right.
Right. Well, yes. My unmapped, you could hand wave and say extension data means anything you didn't already map mapped, and now it's not unmapped. It mapped as extension data.
So what is the reason why we need differ? Like, how is differ different from not specified on the type level?
I would think that defer is not necessarily needed. I kind of brought it up as a potential third state, but we shouldn't add it just because we don't ship a two-state enum.
Yeah, I mean, we have shipped two-state enums before.
So
I mean,
the reason we would need the 3 is once you have once this is a thing on JSON type info, the type is now locked and can't say defer to the global setting.
But generally speaking, what the semantics of the contract customization model is that it will consult the options instance and populate the values in JSON type info. So it's once it's set in the JSON type info instance, it's locked. There's no kind of post hoc consultation sequence, if that makes sense.
A JSON type info is always bound to a single JSON serializer options?
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, it kind of makes sense because there's other things like casing, right? Which once you change your mind on that one, other things might not work anymore.
Okay.
In terms of the naming, how about JSON unmapped member handling?
I think that works. Do we use the terminology mapping anywhere?
Levi, would you like to answer that again?
I thought that we used it in things like data contract serializer, but when I went searching, I couldn't really find it.
I mean, colloquially, I've heard us use that a lot, but
But I think it's okay for this though. And I agree with what Eric said earlier about using member rather than property. Seems like the right thing because we're talking about a mapping back to a .NET member.
yeah, I guess it depends on what you think this
Right.
is referring to.
But because that's the problem is you can't say like keys are what don't map, values can't, like an unmapped value would mean no input matched it. And by saying member, we're saying the .NET type, which actually means it's the value. So the thing that we couldn't map from is the property.
Right.
So
yeah, I think either one would work probably.
I think property is more technically correct, but I don't care enough.
Yeah.
It is more technically correct, but like, given, I think it's going to confuse callers.
Well, because the problem, if we hadn't come up with a JSON required feature right now, and it didn't already have this property must have been specified in the payload, is unmapped member could mean there's a property that no input wrote to.
Right.
Yeah.
And MVC already has that concept, and it sounds like Eric said JSON has it as well.
Yeah, because to me, an unmapped thing is the source, and the source is not a .NET member; it's a JSON property. But if you guys like member better, I'll stop talking.
I mean, the only benefit that member really has is that it's prior art from JSON, right? From JSON.NET. So if people have this naming in their head, at least they have something to find.
Mm-hmm.
That might be useful, actually. I mean, the other question is, like, what you just said, like, what do we call this on the serializer options right now? Basically throwing when you have required members, or is it just automatic? There's no configuration for that. I guess there is no configuration because the type system doesn't allow it on our side, so you only really have one option.
Yeah, and I think to the question that you raised earlier, I'm pretty sure in MVC, at least in V4, we called this unbound members, because that was
binding.
Yeah, that was the set of members that no value was bound to, and if that collection was not empty at the end of binding, then we threw it.
Unbound
Was unbound to or unbound from?
Oh no, that is assuming that you put the equivalent of JSON required on every single property.
Right. So that's unbound too,
Correct.
which
I tend to think of unbound as something not having an upper bound.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, unless you implement compilers for a living, I don't think binding is the thing that
Right.
normal people use.
In MVC, like they had a very specific thing called model binding, and developers within the ecosystem knew what it meant.
right. Like if you're
the
calling a
target
method
audience
called
actually understood it.
if you call a method called bind properties, then now you know what a
Yeah.
like an unbound property now has a context of it's a thing that bind didn't know what to do with.
Yeah.
Or it's a thing that
So
bind didn't write to.
Right. So that was an example of where we were able to fudge the naming a little bit because our target audience very clearly understood it.
Yeah. I think we may have over discussed this, but I still don't like where we are, but I also don't want to talk about it anymore. Yeah.
I think I agree.
I feel like I don't know about you guys, but like I feel like every time we add features to this, we have this lengthy discussion, which kind of suggests that we screwed up the naming somewhere. But now it's so screwed up that we can't fix it anymore.
Yeah.
But I also don't know what to do if I could redesign it, so maybe it's not that bad.
To go back and stick with automatic serializers are bad, we shouldn't have one.
Sure, that would have solved a lot of problems, I agree.
Less is more. Okay. All right.
Just leave it to JSON.net. Everyone loves it, right?
Are we content?
Ish.
Just kidding. James would kill me for suggesting that. It was meant to be a joke. But anyway.
Indeed.
Why would he hate that?
I think he wants to retire the library.
Yeah, I mean, it's supported. Don't get me wrong. Like, but I think he's happy that we're, as Microsoft, supporting a widely used feature like JSON serialization in a good way.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no.
He wants to be on a beach somewhere sipping pina coladas, right?
He
Like,
had the
that's
most popular
basically it.
NuGet package. Now he would like to not have customers and to enjoy his weekends. So.
That's true. Like, I mean, I don't know. Like, every time I hear somebody say, "I want my library more successful," I'm always inclined to say, "Be careful what you wish for." Customers make everything complicated.
Yep.
It's so much more fun if you can just change everything at a will. Anyway, so yeah, I guess let's ship it.
Sounds good.
I hope Eric is not too depressed after spending an hour on this.
Yeah, that was weirdly long.
Yeah.
We should have that as a general label that we can apply to things.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well,
Past
thanks, I
us is
guess.
an asshole.
Alrighty. Random data
that's my favorite
generator
series.
73864. Greetings, Kevin.
Hello, thank you for having me. So this API proposal pretty much does what the idea suggests, which is give me something and I will give you a random permutation about it in some defined length or and as an array, or I'll fill a buffer with something like that. So, imagine you want to, have a random, 6-digit pin consisting of numbers. You would say, I'm going to give you a string containing 0 through 9, and I'm going to say, give me 6 back, and it's going to use all of our nice crypto random stuff to give you back a randomly filled thing. And for the case of hexadecimal strings, we have 2 APIs, one for filling a buffer, one for returning a string, just because we can provide some better implementation and by just directly reading from our crypto APIs, as well as it being a pretty common use case. At least that's the one that I would probably reach for the most. The purpose of the API is to kind of just make this, easier so that developers can reach for the right tools when doing this. It's not significantly trivial for developers to implement, and a lot of times when there isn't something like this in the box, developers are reaching for the wrong tools to do this. Like a personal peeve of mine is using GUID new GUID when they want something random. So this is meant to provide a more generic way of getting random things and provide a better implementation when people want random strings.
And one of the things that's called out in the description too is in ASP.NET, we're considering changing how we do password reset tokens to make them a little more friendly. And an API like this would be immediately usable for that scenario.
So this is intended for like production use, not just for tests.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah,
Like,
an ASP.NET scenario is production.
I know, that's why I was asking. My initial inclination when I saw this, I initially thought it was focused basically on test code. But you're saying it's the primary use case is actually on generating random data for production use.
yeah, I mean, like,
Yes.
for a, if you're simulating a bunch of dice rolls, you can use the existing Git, whatever we called the Git int 32, and that'll do it right. But if you do it by just give me a bunch of random numbers and I'll do it mod, you've introduced bias. And so this is uniformly, randomly across the choices each time ask the question the right way.
Using a cryptographically secure random number generator.
Right. I mean, basically, it's for each slot in destination, generate a random int of the length of choices and pick that one and write it there. So it's not shuffle. It's do this random thing length many times.
So basically what I would give you is I would give you a read-only span of 6 elements with the values 1 through 6. And then I would give you a span with length 1 if I want 1 dice roll, and the length of 2 if I want to have 2 dice roll.
I mean, if you want 1, you can call the existing give me an int 32 between 1 and 6, but
that's the normal
between 1 and
random
7.
number. Or do you mean the one that actually is on random number generator? I thought you want the one on random. Okay, so
yeah,
then okay,
we
this
added
existing
we
one
added
was-
a give me a thing bound by basically to select a random element already. But if you
Gotcha.
had
So
6 random words, instead of generate, like, this builds in the generate the random 0 through 5 index into your list of words and write that into your destination for you.
So how's the span then, like how's the T actually useful? Why can't I just do everything index based at that point?
You
The
could.
purpose of... Oh, I see what you're saying.
You could do everything index based. It's now you're doing a lot of dereferencing under the covers, I guess. Because presumably you want everything to be presumably you're going to build up a destination, an output where you're copying source sub I, source sub J, source sub K, and so on. And we just save you that step.
I guess. I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the inputs, I guess, but like, I would naively think that if my inputs are arrays, then I would rather give you an index rather than filling up an artificial thing that holds an index.
So there is an existing API for this, as Kevin pointed out. If you call random number generator dot get int 32 array dot length, like it will give you an index unbiased chosen into that array, and you can then dereference my array dot or my array sub whatever and do whatever you will with it. Right? Call that in a loop, and that's basically this method. Yeah.
Are we potentially missing additional APIs on random number generator to cover scenarios people need? Like if one of the most common cases is people are doing GUID new GUID to get 128 bits of semi-random entropy, then should we be exposing random number generator get int 128 so that users can correctly get 128 bits of full randomness.
We had that discussion back when we originally implemented that on random number generator, the question of should we do this for int64? The answer at the time was no, because the assumption that the return value was going to be used into indexing into arrays or spans or something like that. And nobody had a good use case for a long at the time.
I mean, I would say the existing fill API is pretty close to that, though, right? You give it a span, and then it just fills it with random numbers. I mean, like that. I mean, how much more do you want at that point, right?
Wait, sorry. If this has already been said, just out of curiosity, how many bits of entropy does GUID, new GUID, or GUID give you?
122.
Okay.
122. So the 6 ones are provided by environment or whatever.
Well, the
they say it's a
GUID
GUID.
basically reserves a few of the bits, but that's harking back to my earlier comment on why GUID new GUID was a peeve of mine. It's because it actually doesn't give you 128.
So I know. So
Say of all the times I've used it, I've only needed 64.
Well, then GUID no GUID is still the wrong answer.
Well, so we're saying that when Get32 was exposed in what was it, Core 3.0, we didn't have scenarios for the other types, but do we have those same scenarios today? Like, it sounds like int 128 at least is a scenario because of how many people use GUIDs to try and generate truly unique numbers.
Well, at least in cases that I've seen, and maybe Kevin's seen different one, it's you use GUID.new GUID to be a temporary password. It's like this has some letters and some numbers and it's long. Moving on.
Can I say we seem to have veered off the topic of the API at hand? Are we discussing another proposal?
Well,
I think
I'm
we're
trying to
discussing-
figure out the scenario here because it sounds like we're trying to use this to cover, you have a set of choices and you want to basically pick a random one of those choices.
No,
but
no. So that's not this. But please go on. Yeah.
You want to do it multiple times.
Yeah, that's the key difference.
So you want to pick a random one from the choices multiple times.
Right.
Is
So
this API?
Right. We basically want to say, we have a destination or returning an array, whatever, and it's 16 things long. We're going to say, from choices, get me 16 things at random indexes and write those to our destination span. The use case for this is for generating temporary reset passwords, or sometimes you get, 6-digit pins in text messages that say, hey, go when you're logging in, enter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there you go. Or maybe they're alphanumeric. It doesn't really matter. But the idea is saying, give me some amount of data to work with, and I'm going to fill some random buffer with those things.
Okay, and what's the difference from this API in doing a for loop that just says
nothing? This is literally the implementation.
No, that there is no difference. The
Aside from
earlier
generate
comment
hex.
that I made is that when developers have to write that loop, they don't. They go use something else, like system.random or GUID new GUID, or they'll implement it themselves wrong using modulus into the choices array or something like that, and they'll introduce selection bias there.
Okay, what's going to tell people that this API exists and they should be using it? Because
me screaming on Twitter and documentation.
Yeah.
So basically, most people and new devs won't know about this, and they'll continue writing the same loop.
I mean, you could make that argument for any API that we ever introduced, but yes.
Right, but system security crypto is it's kind of like intrinsics, where unless you need it, you probably don't go looking there for it.
So that said, we had talked a while back about an analyzer that would try to detect if you're introducing bias into your crypto algorithms. Our team would not be the right team to write that, but I have had conversations with the SDL crew about that. And
Also,
such an analyzer would recommend this API.
For what it's worth, if you're looking for something random, you type random, and if you're in something with IntelliSense, random number generator comes up. One of my questions is why are we introducing a new class here rather than finding a way to put these members onto random number generator? But
You mean like
we're not dealing
system
with
dot
numbers.
random?
No, system security cryptography random number generator.
Mostly because we're not necessarily dealing with numbers here.
Well, we are. The numbers are feeding into the choices, right? That the implementation is get int 32, and then so like if we already have random number generator dot, is it fill?
Yep.
I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
If fill wasn't just for span of byte, but had an overload for span of t, that also took a read-only span of t for the choices. Like, to me, that logically makes sense.
I think there would be confusion between that and say a shuffle, but sure.
I guess the other two considerations here are, so we've got the system security crypto random stuff, and we've got regular system random, and it seems like almost anything you want on one, you want on both. But also, there's the case of if t is a large struct, this is not going to be doing the efficient thing. You're going to want to be getting just a small buffer of indices that you can look up into the choices rather than copying the choices out into a t array or a span of t. Because like if this is a vector 512 or matrices or any other kind of large data, that's going to be a lot of copying when you don't want it.
So then do the loop yourself.
Or fill a span of indices. Like
these APIs are never, I don't think, targeting to be necessarily the most efficient thing possible. The particular thing that I was trying to get out of this API, because I mean, to some respect, it really is just a for loop. It is the simplicity of the API is what I'm really trying to pull out of here, is to have a random data generator that I can point people to and say, here it is, and the shape generally makes good sense to them. And I honestly think 99% of the cases here, the T is going to be, car or int or byte, and maybe a short just for fun.
I could see string going in there if you're doing a diceware-like thing.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a question of being the most efficient, but there's, if we're exposing these, there's like one API that's effectively missing of, give me a fill a buffer of ints with random values from X to Y.
Yes, I agree with that. I think this API is also missing shuffle and choose, which are going to be very commonly used, especially in games.
I don't think games will want a cryptographically random shuffle. They are going to want a fast shuffle, because games typically don't use a cryptographically random implementation of really anything, which is great because that's how I was able to get good chocobos in Final Fantasy VII.
It's fast and seeded.
So that's why I originally on the proposal left, shuffle out, is because I didn't see a good use case for it.
Yeah,
Powerball, but
shuffle really makes more sense on system.random, which is a deterministic random number generator, because like I was doing a thing in a side project where I wanted to shuffle some data, and I used the CSPRNG because it's at this point easier to use than system.random. And then I found I actually wanted the ability to replay a previous run, so I added seeds and switched. And so there is a distinction between the two, and I feel like shuffle is more the other one.
Yeah, which kind of gets back to the point I raised earlier of it seems like, some of these APIs we really maybe want in both places, or to consider versioning them kind of in sync when there's helpers like this, because there's people who want cryptographically secure. They don't care how fast it is. They just want it to be correct, safe, and truly random. And then there's people who want to do the exact same thing, and they're going to have the exact same problems with bias and everything else. They just want it fast, deterministic, and seeded.
I mean, it seems like the scenario that Kevin is really talking about, like the hero API is really at the bottom too, right? Like that's the one-stop shop that you really want, right? Like a replacement for, I want a password, I want it, a specific character range. I don't really care what it is. I just want to give you the length, and you give me back data, right?
Well, I mean, if you're doing passwords, you have to consider like 5 other factors as well, because every website does it wrong, and half of them are like you have to mix uppercase and lowercase, and half of them are you have to provide a character, and the other half say that those same characters are illegal.
Right. I mean, that's why when I doodled the sample, I said if you are the website and you're generating, here's your temporary password to prove that you have access to your email, go click it, because by definition, anything they generate is valid.
Yeah, I don't think a password is necessarily the target use of this, but it could be useful for something like, a nonce that's used for content security policy, or it could be used for, a reset token that goes into an email link or something like that.
Temporary keychains, that sort of nonsense.
Sure.
Yeah, so the ASP.NET use case is the very first proposed method of their generate FT.
Yeah. I mean, I will say, once we've decided that we think that there's utility in it, even though I'm the one who marked it ready for review, I think our pattern would be that the choices goes first, because span writing things are supposed to be source and destination, but we can talk about that later. It felt backwards today, but it felt natural previously, so.
Yeah, and the other reason to do, so I know that we talked about doing shuffle and friends on random. We would also want to do them here because, policy. We want, for instance, our partners to be able to use our code. And I'm looking through STL, and system.random is prohibited by STL. It's actually on the banned APIs list. So even if you don't require cryptographically secure random number generators, just like even if you don't require a cryptographically secure hash algorithm, MD5 is forbidden, period. System.random is forbidden, period. Like, it is the rule.
Right.
So what do you do then in the case that Jeremy brought up? Like, you're just screwed, you can't write that app?
No, you do, the API exists on both.
Fair
right,
enough.
which gets to the point that I was raising of maybe we should have some way of ensuring they're versioned in sync. Like we have places and elsewhere within the BCL where we basically say, if we're changing this API, we should also change this other API and keep them in sync with each other. It's potentially a case where we should have a similar rule between system security cryptography and system random. Is what I was saying is maybe something we should consider.
I mean, given that they're already pretty diverse, it seems like you're trying to reconcile something that already is far apart, which I don't know, like, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of desire here. That it seems like the scenarios that are brought up here are kind of mostly applicable on one side right now.
Right, because basically system.random is just give me a double an int 32 or an int 64. Oh, I guess, or a float.
Right, and people have raised and asked for other scenarios as well to help simplify them.
But we would get, like, if we did, let's say we move this to random number generator, and then we want to put a similar thing on random. If we're doing it as static, presumably, or now there's maybe a question of if it's on the deterministic random, should it take the seed? Does it have an overload that doesn't take a seed, which is use the random.shared and modify the shared state? Like, that one gets a lot of other questions. If we add a static, does it take a random as an input so that you could use your own derived random class? Like,
well, I would presume that
weird.
for random, we'd expose it as random already exposes APIs. So they'd be instance methods, and people who wanted a static one would do random shared foo, like they have to do for int32.
Fair enough.
I think when One tricky thing though is the random number generator is specifically got the word number in, whereas system.random doesn't. So it's sounds more ergonomic to put not numbery random things on there. And eventually, if we're going to say there's parity between the two, then we're going to maybe start putting things that aren't there. That was actually the feedback that I originally got when I made this proposal, was it shouldn't be on random number generator. It should be in a new class because it's not making numbers. So
it is making numbers. It's just filling a buffer using those numbers and not exposing those numbers directly.
That's not something that a consumer of the API is going to care about. Everything is numbers under the covers, you know. So, I mean, yes, but
yeah. But like back to my earlier question, like how do you seed one number generator today? You can't, right? There's no seeding.
You can't.
Well, right. The crypto RNG
APIs
is
don't let
unseeded.
you do that.
Which I think also sounds like in crypto, like why would you ever instantiate this guy then?
Well, you wouldn't. It's static.
Well, it's an abstract class, I think, but
Oh, sorry. In random number generator in cryptography was designed as abstract. We've retroactively decided that was a mistake and started adding static methods on it and said never instantiate this again.
I see. So it's effectively a static helper, similar to how we dealt with most of the crypto algorithms at this point, right? Where you call the
Right.
static star one dot
Because like
blah, right?
random number generator fill is static.
Right. So are all the other get bytes.
So are
ones, I think, right?
yeah, all the gets. Like this get
Yeah.
bytes is yeah. We mixed some
And then
static and non-static, but it's the random number generator that
Yeah.
system security cryptography RNG shouldn't have been abstract because it just caused a lot of problems.
And we
I mean, if
obsoleted
you-
the only thing that derived from it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you really could go back, right? Probably what we should have done is not have random number generator at all, and just have effectively read the random class with like two fields. One of them is the non-cryptographic seeding, and the other one is the cryptographic seeding. And then you choose the one you want, and they have the same API shape, right? And then if you really want a custom seed, you instantiate it yourself, and then put whatever seed you want, right?
Well, we don't want to conflate using cryptographically random seeds because, you know, the bigger issue with system.random is you can recover state regardless of how secure your seed state was, your initial seed was. And there are some APIs that you just literally cannot implement cryptographically random, like, you know, next float or something like that. Like that's a very hard thing to implement cryptographically random because of, you know, the way floats work. We've been asked for it and said like, well, that's actually extremely difficult to do.
Or because you have to like get like 5,000 numbers before you hit one that is actually a legal float value.
I can't even wrap my head around how I would even consider implementing that right now. But you know, yes,
Because there's bias.
Yeah. So you can generate a bitwise random float, but the distribution over the range of float is non-even. It's an exponential curve, and so if you want an even distribution of floats between, let's say, 0 and 1, then you get 16 million unique floats.
How the heck did you come up with that number right now?
Because there's there's two to the power of 24 bits in the significand. So you end up picking a stable exponent and then generate basically random bits for the significand.
I see.
And that gives you an even linear distribution across the range of 0 to 1, which is how random works today. But that, you know, you don't get 2 billion unique values. You get 16 million, and that itself ends up introducing later bias if you try and use those within your code.
Right, because like if you're not doing something like Monte Carlo, then what are you doing like get next float for? Like normally you'd be using like non-float types, right? For actual cryptographic stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Tanner, then it sounds like you make the case that they shouldn't be the same, really, right?
Well, it's more like for things like this, which have clear use cases for both random and non-random scenarios, and multiple people, not just me, have raised them, including for things like people want to use these types of APIs in games. You could think of simple apps like I just want to shuffle cards in a deck. People want an API that does a shuffle-like behavior, or you've got 6 choices, give me a random one. All of those are fairly common standard things where we're wanting to expose this API because people inherently do it wrong. So if we want people to discover the API and do the right thing in both cryptographic and non-cryptographic scenarios and help with discoverability, then we can expose that. And then an analyzer can trivially say, hey, you should use this one instead because system random is banned. If you're in a cryptographic context and using system random is banned. And the APIs that don't exist, like system single, we can flag as like, hey, don't do that. Here's why.
Hosting question, Emo. Do I want to block user on YouTube or block in restream chat?
I usually do it in the restream chat, I think.
Just which of these 2 options?
I
hit that one.
I think, yeah, that's the one that I'm using.
Okay.
I don't know what, I guess, yeah, I don't know what the restream one does.
I didn't remember there being multiple options. And now there are.
I think that must be a new thing.
New options confuse users. Okay.
You moved my cheese. So, okay, if we don't zoom out and we just look at this one and say, basically, yes, there may be other things we could have, like shuffle, but the thing that we are really proposing here effectively is you generate a sequence of things based from some choices, right? So,
right.
Is this something that we would like to have? And if so, do we want to have, this in 2 places or just this one place? And do we think the API as proposed here makes sense?
I think that makes sense. I don't have a strong opinion on if they're on RNG or RDG, but since I think they make sense, that's why I was asking the question of should we be considering it for the other important contexts as well. And I don't care if that's a future API review decision or not. I just want to raise it as it's maybe something we should consider after this and moving forward.
Let's suppose right now we have this API on random number generator, no matter what it looks like. What would be the benefit of also exposing it on random? Is there a different implementation we would use, or is it just because we want it in 2 places, or what?
It can be seeded, deterministic, and faster. 4 scenarios where you do not need cryptographic purposes. For this one, it's not seeded, so it's always random. You can't rely on determinism for results. That makes it a poor choice for most of the policies we have around tests. Most of the time, despite some people asking for it, we force a fixed seed for all of our tests to ensure that we don't get sporadic and random failures, etc. So, whereas system random is blocked from use in some scenarios because it's non-cryptographic, these cryptographic APIs are likewise blocked from use in many non-cryptographic scenarios because they are non-deterministic.
Now that's an argument that I totally buy. That. So if you want something for tests, then yeah, it seems like having text generation would be useful. But if you can't seed it and can't replicate your tests, then that's unfortunate. So then, what if you would only have the bottom APIs? Would that be bad?
What are you calling bottom? The generate hex?
Yeah.
I think if we wanted to cut something, I would get rid of the generic ones. I think the string one is also pretty useful. I think that's the ASP.NET scenario because I don't think they're using just hex cars. I think the ASP.NET scenario is using some, I think, Crockford 32 version of, easily to identify characters. But after that, then, I mean, the string one is just going to be calling the generic ones, well, with string create, and just figured at the time could just make it public.
And I was actually proposing cutting the middle ones, and then basically only leave the top generic one because that's the most versatile, and then having the bottom ones as the workhorse for most people.
Well, I mean, this one is just we can allocate the array for you instead of you passing it in. If you think we're to the point that span is usable enough that we don't want the array returning one, then sure.
Well, I mean, if we want to have a non-span one, then I think the top one is not. So the middle one is still not helping you that much because at least the second argument still has to be a span. So you still rely on the implicit conversion, right? At least. You could say that usability-wise it may not make a difference, but then you would still have to have an overload that takes an array, I guess. But yeah.
Fair. But
I mean, realistically, if you're an advanced user, right, we're not talking like 100 lines of code, right? We're talking like 4 lines of code at maximum, right, or 3, right?
Yeah.
Probably 2.
So I mean, the question on this one, like, if you actually want a system.string that was populated randomly from a set of choices, this requires doing string.create with a callback, and so it's, do we push that on people or do we do that for you?
And my argument was, since generate really is just kind of a short implementation, the overall purpose of the API was to make quick, easy one-liners.
Right, fair enough. I mean, yeah. I mean, frankly, I think it's fine. I think that the only question I have is, how do we think the name generate is? Like, generate seems to be this open-ended thing when what you're really talking here is somewhat specific. I mean, text is obviously bad because it's not just text, but like I was thinking phrase maybe, because realistically what you do is you create a sequence of values given some choices, right? Which is, I think, very different from, you know, get bytes or get int, when we really talk about effectively one atomic unit.
Oh, it's basically doing a fill from an input, right?
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
or you could also view it as it's doing shuffle with a choice of, can I repeat an index versus not? In vectorization, shuffle does not purely mean no repeating. You can select the same index multiple times and still have it have been shuffled.
The shuffle is weird when you completely
permute?
change the. Well, I mean, yeah, it's a permute is basically what I'm thinking of shuffle, but then what we really do here is you increase or decrease the size of the alphabet, right? Which to me is like not really the same operation. It's more like an n repeated pick from a set of values, right?
Right.
Which is not what I'm thinking of as a shuffle.
Because shuffle, most people think of shuffle as what you do to a deck of cards.
Yeah.
You started with 52, you end up with 52. They were distinct, they're still distinct. This is more like pick 5 lottery numbers from different, like, you've got the same 1 through 36 in all 5 ball tumblers, but you're going to pick different times so repeats can happen.
Yeah.
It's a heck of a lot harder to actually implement a good shuffle. Have we discussed adding that?
Shuffle's actually easy.
It's more than a loop with one line in the body of the loop.
No, it isn't. You start at the highest index and you generate what's the index that I want to swap with, which is allowed to continue your own place, and you just go backwards till you run out of spots. It's a it's a single for loop.
My point is, it's more complicated to figure out how to get it right.
Fair enough.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why, like, this originally came back to and was mentioned in the thread, like, should we have a shuffle?
So, to be clear,
it seems weird adding this without also having shuffle, because to my mind, that's the one that takes a lot more thought to figure out how to get right.
Yeah, shuffle and choose are big.
I would agree, but I think we also determined that there's no good use case for a crypto random shuffle. And a shuffle on system random would probably just be a separate proposal.
Well, I mean, one of them would be so going back to games, poker games do want truly random shuffling and not deterministic repeatable shuffling in some cases.
Like things
Okay,
like
that's
Diceware do have the I'm going to give you information so that you can prove after the fact that I didn't cheat you, and that means that they need something resembling a seed, like that they give you the hash of the seed, and then you can come back and go, damn, that was the answer you did.
Yeah, I kind of tongue-in-cheek mentioned, like, if you're doing online gambling in .NET, like, God help you. But given what was mentioned
You think
earlier,
people don't?
There are interesting legal implications that I don't want to get into right now because I simply don't know a lot of them. All of that said, given what we mentioned earlier about like some internal partners especially might not be able to use system.random but might want to shuffle, like we should consider adding those across both classes, you know, echoing what Tanner had mentioned earlier.
So I'm not opposed to that, but I also feel like it seems like we're moving the goalpost, right? Because this proposal here has nothing to do with shuffling, right? Like we can say maybe we should also have a shuffle, but I think it would be a separate proposal, right? Like I don't think we should hold this one hostage just because we don't have a proposal for shuffle.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think these APIs are all things that we would have, and we're saying that shuffle may also be good to have, particularly because it's more complex than just the for loop needed for generate, and potentially we want to look at adding these for on random as well to cover the case of I don't want or can't use a cryptographically secure non-deterministic random.
Jeremy is not being he's nerd snapped himself into writing a shuffle.
Actually, I copied it out of my other project. So.
So
Sort of.
It's more than one line.
Yeah, because you need
only
you need
because
that
of his
if.
bracing style, though.
Well, and then
Even
I
that
was
is
like,
3 lines to the body.
I'm like, I can compress my 3-line swap with the 2-line swap or the 1-line swap that I hate, but oh and yeah, I don't need to return anymore. Anyway, shuffle is different, but yes.
So then going back to this one, like, do we like generate?
It'd be nice if we had a different name, but I can't think of one off the top of my head. We could maybe call it generate choices or fill.
I think the fill example isn't bad because you could think of them as overloads to fill, right? And the only odd one would be the generate hexadecimal, but we could easily have a fill hexadecimal, right? That would be kind of obvious.
Fill seems so. Wait, hold on. Are we saying that we're getting rid of the ones that allocate and return?
Right, because fill's bad if it's
filling.
allocated.
I guess that's true.
You know, random data generator fill 5. Like, what does that mean? Whereas generate 5 is go give me 5 things.
I guess that's fair. I mean, that's why I said, like, you know, phrase would be nice. Get phrase maybe, and then you can just have that overloaded, similar to get bytes, get in 32, get phrase. Doesn't seem terrible.
Get choices.
Yeah, the only reason why I don't like that is it's not something I would be looking for, right? Like because realistically, the way I think of this is basically that the span one with T is just a glorified string, right? It's either a string of bytes or a string of chars, right? But like realistically, I think of this as a string operation.
What about just generate choices, and then we can have generate choices, generate hexadecimal, and if we want in the future, you could have things like generate int 128 or generate range or.
The trouble is generate choices. Just the idea that pops in my head when I hear that is that it's remove duplicates, because it's given this set of input, tell me what my choices were. You're not, because it's not generating choices, it's choosing. Choose is, if we want to do that, it's basically choose many.
Yeah. I mean,
Choose
just looking
many
at
is
the,
not a terrible name.
I mean, that sounds like select many, but yeah.
Well, yeah, but that's basically what it's doing. It's selecting many items from choices and filling a destination buffer with those selected choices.
So it should be an extension method over span of t then, huh?
I'll cut you.
No, I mean the only reason what I would do honestly is like I would just look at the API they currently have a random number generator. There's like 12 APIs. Okay, that's an exaggeration. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 APIs that have a get prefix. There's only one with fill, so I would stick with something that starts with get, and then we could just come up with a term. Like I'm fine with. I guess get choices seems a bit weird, but I think it would at least follow the pattern. I guess I'm still a fan of get phrase, and then I would call the argument that currently is named choices just alphabet.
So I don't think get phrase works well when you start considering the T overload.
Why not?
Because you're getting a phrase of ints. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because really alphabet would, if you're making a phrase, alphabet would be words, not alphabet. Or the choices would be words, not alphabet.
Like, what would get phrase of GUIDs be?
I guess, yeah. Yeah, I'm open for other things. Like,
Maybe just get items. You're effectively, like, the indexer is technically called get underscore item. And you're effectively getting multiple indices from the input array, so it's functionally get items. And then that's generic enough to be, I don't know what I'm selecting.
I mean, get items works. Get sequence would probably also work.
Well, get sequence, we'd have to ask, do we feel like we have a type called sequence that's not related to?
Fair enough. Then get items.
Yeah, I mean, we could also call it, get from. But
I mean that. So what I don't like about get from is that it's effectively like the any API, right? You might call it get at that point, right?
fair enough.
It's a. This API does whatever you want it to do. Given the inputs, it gives you an output.
Okay, so far with that.
I mean, Steven already has a proposal up for shuffle, and he's probably done implementing it now. Do we want to just throw shuffle on this? I mean, it's just shuffle span of T.
Sure, if you already have a proposal, might as well write it on the screen.
And then we can always bring a new proposal up for system random.
Right.
My proposal was actually for system random.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say that Steven got that one there, and I thought like that looks straightforward. We should add it here.
Yeah, I mean that works.
Okay, so do we think that we got the destination / length in the wrong order here, or do we think that we're happy with this?
I think the only one that's so we definitely have it ordered source destination almost everywhere else. That also makes it free to, if we ever wanted to make it an extension method, that will be the natural choice for how to make it one. Not that, we're going to, but the natural choice is the input is would be this. If this were an instance method on span, then destination would be the only input. So therefore choices should go first.
Yeah, I think the only reason why you would put choices last is if you think of get hexadecimal as an overload. But since it's not, I think outputting choices first makes more sense.
And the one weird case here is that get items that returns a string isn't necessarily
It's
get
not
items.
resolvable.
No, it is because it's non-generic.
I mean,
Fair
you can literally
enough.
call it get string. I think
Yeah,
that's
but
fine.
I guess it's
But-
if you gave it char would pick the string returning one instead of the array returning one, and that may then
Unless you
Be
explicitly
bonkers to me.
specified the generic argument, in which case it would choose the array.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
But it's just weird enough, and the naming is weird enough in that it returns a string rather than the char input, that I think calling it get string is better.
I mean, if we have get string, I would probably call the other one get string hexadecimal, just to align them.
Sorry if I missed the discussion, but this get hexadecimal is to avoid you having to write quote 0 through 9, lowercase a through f, uppercase a through f. Is that the?
Yeah, 'cause it's
That's
just-
one of the reasons. The other reason is because we can do a better implementation under the covers where we literally just, read directly from random number generator get bytes and then use the internal hex encoding intrinsified hex encoder that just writes to the buffer.
right, instead of using one randomly sourced byte per output char, it would be one randomly sourced byte per pair of output chars.
Would we consider something directly to ASCII/UTF-8?
That's another good reason for this to be called get string.
Okay, I mean, do we think that's infix, which would match English, get hexadecimal string, or do we think it's get string hexadecimal?
Hex string is the canonical way of saying it.
Yeah. Maybe I would honestly remove the decimal. I think we call everywhere else just hex, right? We don't really call it hexadecimal, right? Do we? I thought we had a hex type somewhere, did we not?
We have convert to hexadecimal, which I think we called hexadecimal.
But that
Actually,
was
no,
when
we
we
have-
liked writing stuff out a lot.
No, we actually have
No,
two
that was
hex
like
strings.
last year.
We have system datetime parse dot hex. We've got VB is full of things called just hex.
The
no,
new
it's
one
not.
that just got added
Hex
is called
digit, hex converter. Those are internal though. Internally, we prefer hex.
Oh,
I mean,
convert was
on
to hex
convert
string.
is the- yeah, it's two hex
the new
string
one
on
that just
convert.
got added is called to hex string.
Yeah.
I remembered it wasn't 2 hex, and I didn't remember string being in it, so I thought it was 2 hexadecimal.
So since I just tried to use convert to hex, I was annoyed that it doesn't have a lowercase option. Does anybody care that there's a lower? Because the internal API actually has a case argument you can pass in. Just throwing it out there.
I mean, we could add a bool case if we wanted, but
Now's the time to ask this question.
I thought we already had an enum type. Maybe that was only internal.
It's only internal. I found that too. I'm like, oh, there is one, and then oh, it's internal.
Oh yes, I remember because we gave the lowercase the value 32 instead of 0. Because it made life easier for us.
Here you go.
because it's what the Orion.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, we could. I don't.
No, it's fine.
I don't
If
know
don't
that we
an
have.
existing enum.
I don't know that we have really quorum anymore.
I think it's fine. We can leave it off. We can add the overload later, right? So it's a
I think it's good to just have it now because people are going to want all lowercase, and there's many URLs that do all lowercase.
I was about to say, like, virtually, I mean, to me, honestly, uppercase is ugly. Like, I
So-
prefer lowercase.
Some people here's my argument for a tri-state. Some people will want all upper, some will want all lower, some will want mixed.
There's no way we're doing
Mixed.
mixed.
Mix?
Okay, fair enough.
Like,
I thought you were gonna like suggest dashes or something.
No.
because the whole point of having this as a second method is so that we can
Hexadecimal.
do
It's not base 64.
byte fill, not.
Okay, fine by me.
And then I forget, Kevin, were you planning on allowing odd length in
Yes.
the hex? Okay.
Yes.
I still don't understand like what mix would even mean though. I guess it doesn't matter if we're not doing
The-
it.
Base
but-
64.
original-
You just invented base 64.
Oh,
No, so
okay.
That-
62, but sure.
So it's
The
like
original-
hex is a general concept, not like you can just extend the character range.
Well,
The
like
original proposal
for inputs from
was
hex
to
things
allow
is that.
passwords.
Yeah.
The original proposal was passwords that didn't have symbols, so it would have digits, and it would have I guess it was A through Z, so never mind, it wasn't hex. I take all that
62.
back.
So
Yeah.
we'd probably recommend like at that point calling get string or something with your choices,
Right.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the reason it was eventually knocked off is that it turns out it gets very complicated when you work with things like database primary keys, which may or may not be case sensitive. So now did we just, potentially bias toward collisions?
Right. So the reason we proposed, or that I nudged for string length being the input here is there are, I think I've found, or at least asked about, APIs that say they're going to generate a hexadecimal output, and they ask how many bytes of random they should be generating instead of how many hex chars they should be doing. So is this length the length of the string, or is this length half the length of the string that comes back? So string length went into the name here. In this one, it's more obvious because you're just generating from choices, so it should collapse to length and look like the others, I think.
Yeah.
But
then
is that an argument that it should be similar between get hex string and get string and be the number of items, which would be half?
no, this is gonna, if you pass 3, you'll get like 0, 9, F.
You get 3 elements in that underlying
Yeah.
read-only span of char, right?
The length parameters mean the same thing between get items and get hex string. It's just the parameter name changed on get hex string to be more clarifying, since that's the only scenario in which it's ambiguous.
I see. Yeah, because they're basically only 16 choices in the equivalent scenario. Okay.
The only thing is I would change the middle API to also be get hex string and then also take a lower case.
Right, so I was gonna say, do we think that this should be called get hex string, even though we might overload it to write to span of char 8, aka byte?
Yes.
Okay.
I think otherwise I think it's easier if this API is overloaded, because then you find it. I think it's very weird if there's no overload that takes a span at that point, right?
And we're never, unless we expose a UTF-8 string type in the future, and at this point, that seems like maybe it's not going to happen.
It's a
Then
very strong case, but yeah.
It's not going to happen, period.
Okay, and
Give it 2 years, 3 years, and then we'll somebody
No,
will come up with it again.
the UTF, the alias that was working on it is now shut down.
so are we? I believe it is correct that it not go on random number generator, since it's not emitting numbers necessarily. So I am a proponent of random data generator, but that came up, so I'm going to ask the question again.
I think it's fine as random data generator.
I would not, given the type already exists. I'd rather have them on that type, I guess.
The random number generator, you'd rather
Yeah.
put it there. I mean, that's kind of my feeling too, just because like RNG is like a general concept.
Yeah,
Like
was
I
gonna
get
say, in
that
terms
people
of
think of
crypto-
data and not numbers, but yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that makes sense from the perspective of you encounter 2 types of code. One, people who type system var rand equals new random, and people who type var rng equals new random.
Right.
Regardless of it being number generation or not, people consider it all RNG as common terminology. But I don't have a strong preference, and I think random data generator is fine if we want to make the concepts more distinct here.
I mean, on the other hand, like, people rarely type random number generator that quickly, so as soon as they type random, they will both show up, right? And maybe at that point you make a choice.
I don't like the idea of like not knowing which of the two classes a thing is on, and then like in IntelliSense doing random number generator, like, oh, not there, backspace, random data generator
Yeah.
tab.
Yeah,
Like, why not just put it in one place?
yeah, because then you get the other scenario of, well, aren't numbers just data? So
Yeah, I would probably just keep it on random number generator.
Yeah, random number generator also has like this weird hierarchy to deal with. Like,
But that's only internal, right? We don't have any public types inherent in that, do we?
RNG
number
crypto
generator?
service provider is the only public type that derives it, and it's obsolete.
So then, yeah.
It used to be don't instantiate this, call rng.create, and then it was don't even call rng.create, call rng.fill.
Gee,
It's-
that
you
is
don't-
a sea of red.
You don't want an instance, just call the static members. And so
Yeah.
we
then
got
leave
rid
it
of the
on
notion of
random.
hierarchy.
Leave it on random number generator, and then it's at least all in one place. Sweet. All right. That was an intense API review. I feel like we opined quite a bit. Should we
And I-
approve the shuffle API for random as well while we at it, or no?
I think I'd like to take both get items and shuffle for random.
So copy these two and this one onto system.random.
Yeah, and the get string ones I think may require more discussion and depth, and at the very least people can fill the need with the other APIs.
Yeah, I can live with that.
Yeah. I agree.
What's the
with
reason
Jennifer.
that get string is like more controversial?
Depends
I
on
don't
what you
think
do with
it-
the string.
Yeah, I don't think it's more controversial per se. It's just there's a clear use case for specializing string for crypto purposes that was raised, and there's maybe not so clear a need for random, and so we can always take that as a separate review item. I know for random in particular, there's also a proposal up there somewhere for some of the unsigned types, because handling unsignedness is difficult given the current API shape. And then there's also, people frequently use GUID, and we have int 128 now. That's a better suit for the need. So
Do we need... Is random supposed to be user-friendly enough that we want to array overload these? Or are we going to do it with spans and see if people complain?
We do a span and people complain. Yes, I think that's Fine.
VBNet doesn't do spans, right?
so
I think it can implicitly convert arrays into read-only spans at parameter calls. So they can use this one, and they may or may not be able to use this one.
There's a small set of APIs that work with span, but they don't have proper span or ref struct support. Like, you can't do locals and some other limitations.
I mean, I think Steven brought this up, right? Because I think the question was, are we overloading on arrays for eternity, right? Or overloading spans to arrays for eternity? And I think the conclusion was we need to sit down and see what actually works in VB, because every time we have this conversation, we don't quite remember what VB can do. How about I start an email thread right after this meeting with the VB folks, and we make a decision once and for all what to do with that.
I think the other question I would ask though is I think PowerShell is another one where there is no span in PowerShell, and I could maybe see a scenario for system random being used in PowerShell.
Yeah, I mean, one compromise we could do is, because I think in crypto we generally don't have a lot of array overloads. I think at some point we just kind of gave up on that, given that it's also much more narrow. We could just say on random we do overload on arrays, and on RNG we don't, unless somebody asks for that, right? Because it's a more narrow API.
We could also convince PowerShell to do the same support that VB has with parameter conversions, so that minimal scenarios work.
Yeah, that might be hard because I think they rely on reflection a lot. So we have to first make spans not suck in reflection, which I don't think we have fully done yet with that. think we
Like-
did some work for ref structs, right? But I don't think it's universal yet.
Not suck as in not be slow, or not suck as in actually work.
Yeah, the latter.
Okay.
Reflection always sucks. So like it's just does your code work? I think is the baseline.
So, I guess when we're overloading this one to not take from a span, do we want T array or do we want ion removal of T or what?
I think you want to do something that you can index into would be my
That's
guess.
true. Yeah.
So you could do probably I read only list of T, but then you have probably shittier performance if you just take an array. Yeah, I would probably just take an Z array and call it good.
Yeah, if people really need IEnumerable scenarios, they can always request it in the future. Array is the basic.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the real problem is because we need to know what the what the filter is really. We need to know the length. So IEnumerable we'd have to copy it into a list immediately.
Yeah, you need something you can index into and read multiple times from, right? So I think the
Okay.
only sensible thing would be I read only list at that point.
All right. So are we happy
think
with
that's
shuffle
the-
values and these shapes collectively? And I put these. None of these are virtual. You get to write your random algorithm, and then you get this based on getInt32.
Yeah, you can always do random.shared if you don't want to instantiate the guy, right? So
Right. I just
Yeah,
mean if you write your own, if you derive random yourself, you don't get to rewrite how getItems works. You only get to influence
that's what you mean.
how integers get
Yeah.
produced.
I think that's fine, right? The only thing we currently have is sample, I think, virtual, right? Or we do have some overloads in the old days, right? But I think we gave up on that. I think all the new ones we added were not virtual either.
No, we made the new ones virtual. That way, so we made them virtual specifically because we have two implementations of random. One that works when you have a seed, and one that works when you don't have a seed. Because when you don't have a seed, we don't have to worry about back compat, and therefore we can do an extremely fast implementation, and we can change it over time.
Fair enough. So then my question is, do these have to be virtual? Or do they get to just call next and call it good?
I think there's little downside to making it virtual, considering everything else is virtual and the devirtualization support we have in the JIT now.
Well, I mean,
If this were being designed from day one, I would say that nothing on random should be virtual.
well,
But since we already have it virtual, I don't think there's any downside, and it will allow us to do customization in the future if that's appropriate.
So you're saying since we're already pregnant, we might as well spend the money to go to Harvard? I mean, that's a bit of a jump, but sure.
I mean, I guess
I mean-
everything on it is virtual, but
Well, it seems necessary based on the whole seed thing, right?
no, because if you control the seed, you can control the order that the int32s are produced from next. So if this is just written in terms of next, which is the only way it can be, you get a thing. The question is, do we want to make it so that they can jump in and intercept and say, instead of whatever path we did for getItems, that instead of, they want to override it and getItems is now shuffle. And it's like, that seems weird. I don't think we should just let them control the integer generation.
That seems reasonable too.
And we can always make it virtual later, right? Sort of.
Yes, and making
Yeah, that's
something.
a breaking change.
Yes, it should.
Well,
I mean,
it's not
even
a
in that case,
breaking.
we would
It's
do
not
is
a
we would-
breaking change. It is a potential behavioral hole, in that already compiled assemblies, in some cases, because Roslyn does not always emit callvert, it just does most of the time. You may end up not calling the overloaded virtual method. So it's not a breaking change, it's just a potential behavioral hole
Right.
But
in
even-
rare edge cases.
But even if you were to make it virtual,
Yes.
we would probably have a getItems core or something anyway, right? Because you probably want overloading between them somehow, right? You would only have one version that takes a span probably, and then everyone else just calls through that, right?
Depending on whether or not we thought it was important for VB to be able to derive the type. Yeah, but because making it
Sure.
virtual means that now everybody should be doing the argument null exception on values being null here. And so, yeah, public virtual is an anti-pattern in my head. I keep clicking on the wrong thing. All right.
So then
Are we?
let's go with this for now then, and then we can reconsider if somebody brings up a sensible scenario for this to be virtual.
Yeah, and we've got like, basically 12 months to decide if we do need to make it virtual or come up with scenarios or anything else.
So
Yeah.
Tanner, you might be the best expert on this, but the pattern that we're pushing people toward is to use random.shared.whatever. So random.shared.getItems and so on. Within the implementation of that, that's going to have a call to the virtual next method. If that doesn't get inlined, that's going to be a whole bunch of virtual dispatches, isn't it?
Yes, but the JIT, so because it's a loop, and because it's a call to an instance method, we can resolve the virtual dispatch once and then continuously invoke to the same method rather than repeated virtual resolution. It's basically partial guarded devirtualization is also possible in some cases.
What did you just say? Partially guarded devirtualization?
Yeah, so it's not so there's devirtualization, which is like you fully devirtualize and you have a direct call to the appropriate method, and then there's like guarded devirtualization, which is based on PGO data or other metrics. You can basically put a branch that says if it's this type, then do this special path that is a devirtualization, otherwise fall back to the actual virtual lookup. But in the general case of a for loop, you can, since the instance isn't changing, we can always cache the lookup once and then make just the single indirect invocation, so we don't have to do the expensive part of virtual dispatch over and over.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's like this all sounds familiar. It was in Steve's perf improvements thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but long story short, you're not worried about that causing perf problems.
Right. I'm
Okay.
not.
Okay. Thank you for that.
I mean, I really hope not that random is your bottleneck in your code.
Well, this would be calling next potentially thousands of times in a loop.
Right. Yeah, I get. Well, there's also the case of like no, so I guess that is the one case where if we made it virtual, a user could decide to optimize it that way. Is they could basically have the equivalent of a next bytes, except instead of filling in bytes, they fill in a temporary local buffer of, like, let's say 16 they could do 16 int32 next calls at once, without having to repeatedly go through the virtual lookups and things like that. There are optimization opportunities there without changing the implementation.
Indeed. And again, we can, decide on that from GetItems core and whether or not that's overloaded and what
We
have
could
you.
also make it internally virtual, but not externally virtual, I think. And
Cheaters
so
and
we could
correlate.
so we could have thread safe random and what is it, X0 hash random or the Exoshiro impl. We could have them do specialization without
'cause-
making it publicly virtual.
Fair, because once we make the implementation of this, we can never change it. At least not for the regular random class.
Right,
Right, not for regular.
because this is deterministic choices, assuming that you've given it a
Right.
seeded random.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
if you
does
can't do
any
any type
other-
of clever caching.
If you call random.shared, then you get whatever you get.
Right.
Does any other method in random call next, or call one of the other virtual methods?
I mean, they all call each other.
Do they?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Sample's the
very
only.
incestuous
You
type.
can write just sample, and all the other things will defer to sample.
Okay.
And then if you think doubles are stupid, then you override the integer ones, and there's some hierarchy between them. It may be you have to
Because
override
I'm looking
everything
at
once
the
you think doubles are stupid.
implementation, and it all looks like it calls through to the wrapped impl base or whatever. So if you don't override everything, I don't see how it's like calling back into your virtual.
Well, the impl base is internal.
But that's the point, though, right? The impl base doesn't have a back reference to my virtual random class where I just override or overrode sample.
Oh yeah, but if you override that, like you're not getting that impl class at all. You're getting your own thing.
Only for sample. But like we're calling through for impl for like next and everything else, right?
Right, but we've got two internal sealed classes that both implement impl-base. Impl-base is basically an interface, and
Because
it's just an abstract
impl
class in
is
practice.
net5 compat derived impl if you are a derived type.
Right.
Because in
And it's gonna
the
keep
in the
calling back into
constructor it asks, am I the special random, and if so, use the special thing, and if not, then use the thing that defers all the calls. So
Oh,
this
so
line.
the net5 compatible one and not, so that's only used when you're seeded, right?
That's only
So
used when
that
you've
one
derived
does have-
random.
Okay, I see. I
And
see.
seeded.
So that does have the parent back reference. I see it now. So that makes sense.
Right. So then, who are you? And so then, next int 64 calls that, which calls next, which calls impls next, which calls sample, which right.
Right, because there's compat seed and compat derived, and then there's
Got
the
Yeah.
exershiro.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was all done for performance because there are so many virtual method calls. When we tried making a faster random, like we ended up regressing the performance of things like seeded and derived classes. So all of that impl stuff is to kind of paper over that.
Right. So that means that if you're not deriving and you're not using a seed, then we're avoiding those virtual calls anyway, right?
Yeah.
Correct. There is a small performance penalty, I believe, if you're deriving it, that wasn't present in prior versions. But I believe when we actually scouted the landscape, we said that subclassing it is not all that common, and we were willing to take the small hit there in order to make everything else faster.
Yeah. And based on the existing fact that we have this shim here in the middle already, means if we want the X thing to do a faster pre-allocate, we could do the same behind the scenes. It's virtual with this for the shared instance.
Yeah.
So. All right. I hit approved. Thank you for putting up with us, Kevin. And
That was fun. This is making up for all of the really easy proposals that I've done in the past.
Yeah. And thank you, chat. They pointed out that somebody using VB lost the ability to call a span-based method between net6 and net7. So
yeah, it looks like they're fixing it, though.
But this is we apparently aren't even good at knowing ourselves what does and doesn't work, because we broke it across releases. So that's not to say we don't need a good plan going forward. Previously, what we had was high-level types are friendly, and the lower level you get, the more span-based you're allowed to be. But yes, it does feel like we are in either we need to say that's our position forever, or figure out what our transition points are. So. But with that said, we are an hour over. So to the 12 people still watching.
This is basically the last API review of the year. Because next week's Thanksgiving in the US, and so basically everyone's going to go on vacation till the new year.
Yeah, I mean, I'll actually be here next week, but we may lose quorum, so I don't know if Emo's already canceled. The 29th is probably fine, and then I'm probably here December 6th. But we'll
Yeah, we can take a look. I mean, we are also not drowning in API reviews, so I wouldn't mind if you just called it good.
We're not drowning yet.
Yeah, we can be if you'd really like.
Yeah, I mean, there's more stuff coming in, but like all the stuff that is coming in right now is marked for 8, and there's, I guess there's a decent amount of them now. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So, yeah. Yeah, maybe we should do another backlog grooming exercise to avoid drowning in January, but if we don't have quorum, we don't have quorum.
Yeah, looks like 13, according to your site's ability to count.
Fair enough.
And yeah, I know that there was already a thing. Somebody was talking about wanting to get some stuff in for Preview 1, and I was like, well, if you're not already at the top of the API review list, you've missed Preview 1. because December doesn't exist at Microsoft. So, but yeah, so Emo, you should do some thinking, or you and I should do some thinking about what the sessions are for the rest of the year, so we can let the YouTube calendar be up to date now that you got it working again. So everyone, rejoice! I'm gonna push the button because Emo told me it works now. We have a button again. So we'll try to get this updated, YouTubers, so that you know when to join us and not. But you know, like that one's probably, these two are probably guaranteed not. And because while Americans don't like taking vacation, we do like taking holidays. So with that, it's lunchtime in Redmond.
Bye-bye.
And potentially happy holidays. But we'll probably see you before the end of the year.